There may be people in this room who say, I am a Christian, but sometimes I struggle with this idea of Jesus as divine. I struggle with this idea of raising from the dead. It's just so hard to believe in. Let me tell you why I believe and why I think you should believe that Christ was raised. How do we know Jesus was raised from the dead? Number one, the eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses are so many, and this is why this is so important. How many of you remember December 31st, 1999? How many of you remember that? Okay, how many of you remember Y2K? Let me say it that way. Yeah. So going up to December 31st, 1999, there was this weird hysteria in America because computers were programmed in such a way that the date code on the computer was two digit. So December 31st, 1999 would have been recorded 12/31/99. Someone figured out in the late 90s, wait a second, when it turns 2000, that means that 99 is going to flip over to double zeros, and every computer is going to think, oh, it's 1900? Well, then I don't exist yet, so I'm not going to work, and everything's going to fall apart. That was the theory. People were terrified of Y2K. I had relatives who went out and bought a milk cow. I'm not making this up. Because, what if there's no H-E-B anymore? What if there's no Kroger anymore? And I wasn't quite sure they were crazy, right? I mean, what if? So a lot of us, including stick in the muds like me that go to bed at 10:30, so we stayed up till midnight on that New Year's Eve. We wanted to see what happened. And you know what happened? Absolutely nothing happened. But imagine today someone writes a book and they say, on December 31st, 1999, at the stroke of midnight, every computer in the world stopped functioning. Satellites fell from the sky. Stock markets collapsed. Nations were overturned. Revolutions started. Riots in the streets. Beautiful pop stars married meathead football players. I mean, crazy stuff happened. This is why you should stay awake. You never know what I'm going to say. If such a book were written, it would never be published. But even if it were published, none of us would buy it because we'd all say, that's baloney. That's ridiculous. Either I was there or my dad was there or somebody I know was there. They know it's not true. Here's why I'm saying all that. When Paul is writing 1 Corinthians 15, and he's saying, there are 500 people alive right now, including the disciples, including Mary Magdalene, including several of the women who followed him, including me, including James, his brother. When he's writing those words, he's saying they all saw Jesus alive outside the grave. When he's writing those words, it's 20 to 25 years after the events themselves. Now, here's why that's important. People want to believe, if they don't want to believe in the divinity of Jesus, they'll say, well, there's lots of legends and myths in the ancient world. Just take the stories of King Arthur, for instance, and how there may have been a guy back in the days of Roman Britain who was a sort of an Arthurian king, but he probably didn't pull a sword out of a stone or have a wizard named Merlin or have quests with the Knights of the Round Table. All that stuff came up over time as people told stories to try to fill in the gaps. And so they'll say, it was the same way with Jesus. Jesus died, and at first people were like, well, he's still sort of alive in a way if we keep following his teachings. And then over time, stories got told, and those stories got believed, and then pretty soon people inserted them into the Gospels. But that's impossible because, like I said, they were saying that within 20 to 25 years. In fact, they were saying it immediately, but they were writing it down 20 to 25 years after it actually happened. That's way too soon for legends to take place because there were people still alive who could have said, no, I'll take you to the tomb. It's right there. His body is right there. That's the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, just outside the gates of Jerusalem. There he is. But everyone knew the tomb was empty. The stone was gone, and so was Jesus because he was alive. There were witnesses to prove it. Now, that's not all I've got. Number two, there is the change in the apostles and those who followed Jesus. The Bible is, and I love this about the scriptures, very blunt about its heroes. If you read the Bible from cover to cover, you will be, if you've never read it before, you'll be astonished, frankly kind of scandalized at some of the sins that God's people get up to. We're talking heroes of the Bible who do things that you and I would be like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. You did this and God continued to use you? The exception is Jesus, right? Everybody else did terrible things. His apostles especially, not that they did terrible things, it's just they never seemed to get things right. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 gospel records of his life, you come to the conclusion that, Jesus needs to cut these guys loose. They're just holding him back. They never seem to understand what he's saying. They're always a beat behind. They're always misinterpreting his parables and his teachings. They want to roast people with fire from heaven. And he's like, oh, come on, guys. I mean, then they completely lose their minds and want to run away and give up. They're always arguing about which one of them is the best, which is ridiculous. And then you turn the page to the book of Acts, and they're completely different. They're completely different people. Now we're familiar with self-improvement these days. We all know about workout plans and diet plans and going back to school and learning new skills, but we never see people make an absolute U-turn in their personal character. But these guys are completely different in Acts. Peter, the guy who denied even knowing Jesus a few weeks before, stands up on the day of Pentecost in front of a crowd of thousands, and no preparation, no notes. He just preaches a sermon and 3,000 people get saved. And a few weeks later, him and John are standing in front of the Sanhedrin, the people who condemned Jesus to death, and they're like, kill us if you want to, but we're not going to stop preaching in his name, because his name is the only name by which people can be saved. And this tiny little movement becomes thousands, and then within a generation, they're saying, these are the people that have turned the world upside down. And within 3 centuries, the whole Roman Empire's official religion is Christianity. How does that happen? Because I'll tell you, there are stories of religion starting and exploding, but it's usually because they become the official religion of a particular ethnicity. And as those people multiply, then that religion spreads. Or, like Islam, it spreads through military conquest. And as the followers of Muhammad conquer a new land, it becomes Muslim. It didn't happen that way with Christianity. It happened because individual Christians said to neighbors and coworkers, Jesus is alive. Let me tell you what he's done for me. And the unlikely thing about that is everything about early Christianity it's almost custom designed not to appeal to Romans. Because it says there's one God instead of many, because it says you can't worship the emperor, so you're going to get in trouble with the government. And it says that you have to be sexually chaste, that you can only have sex with your spouse and for the rest of your life. And that wasn't a Roman sexual ethic at all. It said that God cares about the weak, it cares about the poor, that he cares about people who are disenfranchised. By the way, most of these Christians who are saying these words are slaves, they're women, they're people who don't have any social power. So you don't get any social or political clout out of becoming a Christian. I mean, there is no reason for you to become a Christian other than you just have come to believe that this guy Jesus really is alive. Now, how does that happen? There's a couple of scholars who say something similar. Luke Johnson says some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement that earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright says, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And I'll tell you one other thing about the change in those people. John chapter 7, it's little known, but John chapter 7 says that early in Jesus' ministry, his own brothers didn't believe in him, which you can imagine how that would make Jesus feel. But later on, they became believers in the book of Acts. They're among the apostles, and James himself writes a book of the Bible, becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church, is martyred for the faith. Now listen, I have one brother. I love him. I think he's a great husband and father. He's an architect. He's done great things with his life. I'm incredibly proud of him. I can tell you with absolute certainty that boy is not God. And he would say the same about me. And it would take a heck of a lot of evidence for me to change my mind on that. The fact that Jesus' own brothers, who did not first believe in him, came to believe in him at a time when believing in him meant death, that tells me something happened. What explains that change except that the story is true, that Jesus rose from the dead? Here's third evidence. Third piece of evidence is related to that, the testimony of martyrs. Now, I'll tell you, the theory I gave you earlier that it was a legend, not many scholars actually still try to promote that anymore for the same reasons I mentioned. There just wasn't the time for a legend to take place, to take shape, to evolve. And so the prevailing theory today among those who don't want to believe that Jesus is divine is the apostles made it all up. That the apostles, after Jesus died, they said, we got to keep this thing going, so let's get in there, let's take his body, and then tell people he rose again. Now let's just get past the point that they had to fight off Roman guards and roll away a stone. If you can even believe that's true. I want you to imagine how hard it is to spread a lie like that, if it is a lie. Just imagine you and I are members of a church somewhere where the pastor is so charismatic and revolutionary. When he dies, we're like, okay, we got to keep this thing going. So we rob the grave. We take his body. We somehow get away with that crime. And then we start telling people, brother Joe is still alive. Reverend McGillicuddy is still around, and he's still preaching, and he's still doing great things, and you can believe in him and he'll change your life. Everyone who knows you would hate you at that point. They would distance from you. Your closest relatives would say, I want nothing to do with you. You've lost your mind. And then the authorities would show up. They'd want to know who took that body. They'd grab you and put you in a room with a couple of detectives and start asking you questions in the back of your mind. You know that your friend Jim Bob is down the hallway in another room with another pair of detectives, and you'd think, Jim Bob's going to sing like a bird. I better say the truth or else I'm going away for a long, long time. It wouldn't last. You couldn't keep your story straight. Chuck Colson put it this way. Chuck Colson worked in the Nixon administration. He was the special attorney for special counsel for Richard Nixon. So he did a lot of shady stuff in his job and went to jail for it. In jail, he got saved, came to meet Christ, wrote some great Christian books, started a great prison ministry called Prison Fellowship. In one of his books, he says, and I love this, he says, here's why I know that Jesus really rose from the dead. He said, when I was working for Nixon, there were about a dozen of us who knew what had happened in Watergate. All we had to do was keep our story straight. All we had to do was just keep saying, the president knew nothing, the president knew nothing, the president knew nothing, but we couldn't keep that story straight for even a few weeks. Within just a few weeks, we cracked. He said, we're talking about hundreds of people, men and women and children, and they weren't being threatened with jail. They were threatened with death. And some of them did die. Some of them were nailed to crosses or beheaded or burned or thrown to wild animals or killed in other gruesome ways. And all of them, every single one of them died proclaiming, Christ is risen. Colson said, that's impossible unless it really happened. Because, we know about religious fanaticism, and we know about like young men in the Middle East who hear their religious leader say, go and kill these people, blow yourself up, and you'll go to heaven. And they believe it because they've been told a lie, and they believe it. But these people knew whether it was true or not. They were the ones claiming to have seen Jesus. Nobody dies for what they know to be a lie. And yet hundreds of people died proclaiming Christ is risen. What does that tell you?